Good morning everybody. Is all the microphones and everything okay? Good, excellent, thank you. Well, thank you for coming along to listen to me today. My talk is about structural engineers and, you know, what is it we actually do. The sort of background of this is that I'm often told, I suppose, by clients and particularly estate agents and surveyors and property developers, that they find they get very different approaches from different structural engineers. You know, one structural engineer will look at a building and say, oh, it's fine, nothing to worry about. And another one will, you know, virtually condemn it. So the talk really, the beginning of the talk really is to just explain a bit about the background of structural engineers, you know, what sort of training we get in looking at buildings and that sort of thing. And then I move on a bit to some recent case studies, particularly around the subsidence problems that we've had since we had this very dry summer last year. Been a lot of subsidence, and I've got a few examples, case studies, and a bit of explanation about the problems we get with clay soils and trees particularly, and a bit of explanation as to really what should be done and what often isn't done. And then a few other case studies of some examples of typical problems that I come across, some good, you know, some bad. So, what does structural engineers do? Well, interestingly, most structural engineers don't start off as structural engineers. I don't know if there's any other engineers in the audience, but I'd be interested to hear your views later as to whether you've had the same sort of background that I have. But most structural engineers start off doing civil engineering. There are very few degree courses for structural engineers in the UK. Most people start off doing civil engineering. And I started off my career on a civil engineering sandwich course, hence the picture. And members of the public always said to me, oh, what did you learn on that then? You must have learned how to make sandwiches. Ha ha ha. Well, yes, I can make a sandwich. I made that sandwich, in fact. I quite like making sandwiches. But it's not really what we're taught to do. Civil engineering is a very broad subject. It covers fluid dynamics, pipeline design, land surveying, interestingly, geology, highway design, highway construction, whole rake of subjects, and then a little bit somewhere down the line of structural engineering. And most of that I did at university was the analysis of structures as opposed to the design. And we didn't do anything at university about how to investigate buildings or historic buildings or anything to do with actual practicality of buildings. That was all just sort of taught on the job. So, and I think that's still true today. I don't think young engineers get any training or teaching at all at university about real building construction. So when they come out of university full of all this wonderful knowledge, this is the sort of thing they think they're going to be doing. So the one on the left is the Blinking Eye Bridge which links Newcastle and Gateshead. Fantastic piece of structural, civil and mechanical engineering. It actually folds to allow ships and boats to go underneath, and then it folds down again to form a curved horizontal footbridge. That's in the sort of up position. A fantastic piece of engineering. It was designed by Gifford and Partners, who had an office here locally. They're called something else now. Fabulous thing. That's what engineers think they're going to be designing. The one on the right is actually a building in Barcelona. There's several buildings like this in Barcelona. If you've ever been there, it's worth trying to find them. That's actually I think the headquarters of one of the big Spanish natural gas companies. And they have these fantastic, amazing cantilevered sections of buildings. And that's what people think they're going to be doing. All these wonderful computer programs, that's what they think they're coming out of university to design, that sort of stuff. Bit of personal history. That's about the nearest I ever got to designing anything really exciting. I spent a couple of years after I graduated working out in Bulawayo in Zimbabwe just after independence, before Mugabe had gone completely loopy. And I designed and supervised this thing here. So it's not a very good photograph. It was hanging on my office wall for many years. And what this is a bolt manufacturing facility. Under here are some pickling tanks of acid where they pickle bolts. I don't know, Chris might know a bit more about that later. I don't know what that is. And this was the old building, and the idea was to put a completely new building right over the top with a travelling crane underneath, which hasn't been put up yet. And the new building was erected and sheeted in before the old one was demolished, so that the production didn't have to stop. Health and safety wasn't a big thing out there in Africa in those days. You can just see a chap up there in the rafters, no safety equipment at all, you know, bolting bits and pieces together. Down here, these are open tanks of sort of boiling acid solution with no guardrails, nothing to stop you falling in. So I had to walk very carefully around those, and these chaps were just running up and down in between them. I don't think anybody was injured while I was working on it, as far as I know. So that's the sort of thing, that was quite exciting. There was a lot of this stuff going on out in Zimbabwe when I was there. Just after independence, there was a lot of you know, foreign investment and aid coming in, a lot of industrial stuff like this being built, which was great fun. And that's what, you know, I enjoyed doing that. And that's, I think, what most engineers think, sort of thing they like to be doing. But obviously, you come back to the UK and the reality is a bit different. And this is more the sort of thing that we're typically working on today. Somebody's back addition in Portsmouth, and this is an old farm building, which, you know, is in need of a lick of paint, really. That was actually a Class Q conversion. You know, former agricultural buildings being converted back into domestic, which is automatically permitted these days. So that's more the reality, I suppose, of what we do. But just to follow on from my introductory bit, obviously we don't get any training on how to look at these sort of buildings, how to investigate this type of stuff. And most of the knowledge and training that we get comes just from on the job, working with other engineers, older, more experienced people. And a lot of what I learned was from an older engineer when I worked for a company in Portsmouth, a chap called Dennis Stone, who was a lovely old chap, really nice guy, very, very good engineer, very experienced and knowledgeable, did a lot of expert witness work. And he taught me an awful lot about how to look at buildings, what the sort of problems are that you're likely to find and what you do about it. And he was particularly keen, sort of having sort of shown you something, to let you get on with it. You know, he didn't sort of micromanage, he didn't want to sort of look over your shoulder. And one example of that, I was designing a building, can't remember the details now, but I was designing a new building and I was a bit stuck on something, and I thought, well, I'll go and ask Dennis. And I went into his office in the morning and said, Dennis, I'm a bit stuck on this bit, can you help me? He said, oh, a bit busy at the moment, old boy. He said, could you pop back after lunch and we'll have a chat? Okay. So went away, went back after lunch. He wasn't there. He had a secretary in those days, as people did. So I said to his secretary, do you know where Dennis has gone? And he said, oh yeah, Switzerland. And he'd gone skiing for a fortnight. And I think it was done deliberately. I think he deliberately sort of put me off so that I had to make a decision. You know, he felt that he taught me as much as he could, and therefore I should just get on with it. I don't remember what the decision I made was, but none of the buildings I designed when I was with him ever collapsed, as far as I know. I haven't seen them in the press. So it must have been a reasonable decision at the time. And I think that sort of explains, I think, why particularly younger engineers often are not necessarily coming up with the same sort of answers that the older, more experienced engineers do when we're looking at existing buildings, because there really isn't that kind of background and training. It's all just done on the hoof, on the job, really. So just to move on to a little bit about the sort of process that I go through. Typically, I get an instruction to look at a building where there are suspected structural problems, and that mostly comes through surveyors, like I think most of yourselves, where you've done an RICS survey on a building. you've got some leaning or cracking, bowing, bulging, something you're concerned about, and you sort of request a structural engineer's report. I come in, normally get a copy of that, or I ask for a copy of that, or at least an extract that shows me what it is you're concerned about. And the approach I take, just going to sort of go through that really. I always like to start with the outside of the building, get a feel for it, understand the layout, you know, how's it put together, which bits go where, how's it joined up, and a bit about the history. Often I find the history, the way the buildings sort of evolved over time can be, you know, quite important to what the problems are from a structural point of view. So this is just my approach to it. I don't know if all the engineers follow the same approach. There is a lot of guidance from some august bodies. The Institution of Structural Engineers are particularly good and do produce some very good not instruction manuals, but more guidance documents on what to look for, how to go about looking at buildings. And I always try and encourage any younger engineers to really get hold of those and have a good read of them, because they are, you know, they are very good. And they're about the only body, I think, that produces something sort of authoritative. There's lots of books on individual issues, but the institution really is the main one. So this is, I think, the approach that they recommend and how I go about it. Always start off with the externals. Is everything plumb? Looking at, you know, window mullions, particularly an example here. Is everything square? Is everything level? You know, are the windowsills level, the door frames level? And are there any major cracks in the walls? If so, is there a pattern? And also, I'm looking for separations, not necessarily just cracks, but particularly where you get structural movement. Has the brickwork separated from the window frames, for example? Are there tapering gaps? And if there's sealant being put in, you know, is that new, or has it then separated again? Is there more being put in? So I like to sort of work my way around the building, getting a feel for all that. And then looking, as I say, particularly at the history, which can be interesting. This is actually an old vicarage out in the wilds of North Hampshire. Lovely old building, and it had been altered quite a bit. This had been obviously probably originally an outside WC, single brickwork, perhaps with a coal store or something, and it had been sort of altered and extended, nice new roof put on it, extra brickwork added. You know, has additional load been put into things. And I've got a case at the moment of sort of ongoing subsidence, which some other contracting type companies have tried to remedy and sort of failed miserably. And I think partly that's because they just haven't understood how the buildings come together. And I think it's really important to sort of get to grips with that, because it can be quite a factor in it. So having looked at all that, got to grips with how the buildings sort of come about, I then do the same thing internally really. Is everything plumb? Are the walls standing upright? Are the window frames square? Particularly if is it the same inside and outside? Is everything level? Floors, particularly inside, I'm looking at, are they dipping? If they're dipping, are they all dipping the same way? Or are they all dipping in different directions? Is it actually dipping, or is it deflection? You know, if it's sagging into the centre, then that sort of deflection indicates more weakness than movement. So I'm trying, what I like to do is try and get a feel for how the whole thing's kind of moving. What direction is everything going in? Is it all going the same way? Is it all going into the middle or all to one side? If there are cracks, do the cracks outside sort of follow the cracks inside? Do they go in the same direction? Not always the same, because the coursing's often different in the masonry, but do they match? Do they run the same way? So that's what how I go about it anyway. And then, having sort of got all the evidence together, I then like to stand back and try and think about it. Not always easy, as I'm sure you all have the same problem when you've got an owner following you round, you know, asking you if you want a cup of tea, very nice, thank you, but sort of constantly asking you, what do you think, what do you think, what do you think? And often I get that the minute you get out of the car, you know, you just haven't shut the car door and people are saying, what do you think, is this a problem? Well, you know, I haven't seen it yet. So I'm very keen to kind of get them out of the way and look at the whole place, and then at least have 5 minutes to just stand back and think about it all before I then try and answer the problems. And of course the things I'm looking for is, as I say, the direction. Is everything going in the same direction, or are things moving in different directions in different parts of the building? And then with all that evidence, you know, what is the likely cause? I've got some case studies to follow on to show you some examples of some typical and not so typical problems. But having come to a conclusion about the cause, is it due to the age of the building? You know, is it just weathering and deterioration through old age or rot of timber? Is that causing the movement? Or is it an external force? Is it subsidence, settlement, etc.? And of course then the big questions, the $64,000 questions, is it likely to continue? Good question. And if so, how do we remedy it? And again, I've got some examples of that. But those are the things I think that as structural engineers, those are the issues that we're really being expected to determine and sort of come to a conclusion on if we can. So, moving on to a few case studies. As you know, we've had a very dry summer last year. Very hot, a lot of drought. And these are, I've got a few examples here of some subsidence issues arising from that. Particularly, the big problem in the dry weather obviously is drying out of clay soils, and particularly where trees are present. Here, this is a little bungalow on a clay soil down near the south coast. And these are some lovely mature oaks. Very close to the side of this building. House, I think, was sort of 50s or 60s built and had been extended. And this is typical subsidence cracking, which occurred at the rear, due purely to these trees sucking the moisture out of the ground. What happens in the dry weather is that the tree roots push down into the clay soils, and they send almost microscopic little root hairs. And people often say, well, I've dug this up and I can't see any roots. But you almost can't see these very fine roots. They're tiny, tiny little things. And they only seem to become active during a drought. I think during normal years, I'm not an arboriculturalist, I don't know if we've got any arboriculturalists in the audience. We had one last week who, no, okay, good. So I think during a normal year, there's enough moisture on the surface and in the top sort of metre or so of the clays for the trees to suck the water out that they need. During a drought, that top metre dries out and the trees then start to push these fine roots down into the soil to get the water that they need. I'll come on a bit later to how those depths are supposed to be calculated and the sort of depths to which large trees, can have an effect. But this is a typical example of the sort of subsidence cracking. It's stepped diagonal cracking here following the line of blockwork. So the cracking is slightly different because it's blockwork inside, but outside it's brickwork. So you've got similar cracking, but not exactly the same line. Another example, this was a block of garages. And again there we've got step diagonal cracking down through the brickwork. This again is clay shrinkage. Interestingly here, not so much influenced by trees. This was built on a bank of soil and the clay has dropped here. That path originally would have been up here at this sort of level. And the whole thing was dropping away and the garage was following it. Garage was built on a footing rather than it wasn't on a raft or a big slab base or anything like that. that sort of foundation, a raft or a slab type base, can be a particular problem, and I see a lot of examples of conservatories, even these nice new very expensive ones, where builders and sadly building inspectors even don't always appreciate the depths that need to be dug for foundations during drought when there's clay soil. There's a bit of a myth, I think, that the depth of the foundation is based on the load or the weight that's being carried, and that's true in very large buildings to some extent, but it doesn't really apply to domestic buildings. The depth is really dependent upon, in a clay soil, where the trees are, because the problem is that the tree roots will affect the soil under the foundations to quite some depth. And often I still see examples like this. This is a lovely modern orangery extension really, but built like a conservatory on a shallow slab type base. And this was only 3 or 4 years old. Look, that fence line is this fence line, that's the same fence line. And there's these oak trees at the far side of the neighbour's garden. So quite some distance away, but still close enough during a drought to have this effect. And this side had dropped and the building had dropped toward these trees. And sadly, people just don't seem to understand that it's not the weight of the building. This is obviously a fairly lightweight structure. It's only a single story, brickwork, lightweight roof, mainly glazing, not much going on, but it's still subsided. During that drought period, it's still subsided. And a bit of a problem. I don't know where we go with that with the industry. I can't think that the sort of companies that build these things are going to put in 2 or 3 metre deep foundations. But that's what it needs to prevent it happening. Rafts and things just don't work, unfortunately. Excuse me one second, let's grab a slurp of water. Right, so I see a lot of problems of that sort. This is just a bit more detail on that one. There was a crack there that was underneath the bifold doors at the back. Not a huge amount of movement, but enough to be a problem. You know, enough that if you were trying to sell it, that wouldn't be immediately mortgageable. The other problem that I see quite often is simply settlement of foundations, and this can be exacerbated by clay soils in dry summers because the clay shrinks particularly. This is an example of an older conservatory, really like a side porch conservatory on the side of a bungalow. And this was on a sloping site, with the slope running toward the rear. And I'm not sure if you can see on that photo, but the change in level, the brickwork is level, and the top runs down by, you know, best part of a brick course across the length of it. And this lovely new framing had all been put in to suit that. And I think that's caused simply by settlement of the shallow foundations, probably because they're more shallow at the rear than they are at the front. They're put in level, and because of the sloping site, they're actually closer to the surface at the rear than at the front. And during the dry weather, again, the shallow foundations will suffer from simple clay shrinkage. This is another example of a modern conservatory come orangery. This again was only 3 or 4 years old. Roughly where the photo is taken from, there was a little copse of trees, mostly oak trees, and during the dry summer again, the roots have penetrated under here, sucked the moisture out, and that's the sort of cracking at the separation point where the flank wall meets the original house. The owner had observed that being constructed and knew that the foundations were only, I think, about 800 millimetres deep, which probably at the time, everybody thought, well, that's okay, 2'6" in old money, that's good enough. But completely ignoring the fact it's on a clay soil with some big trees, 10 metres or so away. And disappointing, because really, I think people should know better. And there's been a lot of research done on this since these problems first arose. And the main body that published the details of how foundations should be designed is the NHBC. There was a lot of research done by the Building Research Establishment, and the NHBC have adopted that and have produced guidance, quite detailed guidance. And I just put this up as a bit of an example. These tables are quite detailed, quite difficult to read, but it does show how it should be done. They categorise the clays into high, medium and low shrinkability. And then they also categorise all the typical trees, not into every species, but just by groups of trees. So the worst ones being broadleaf trees, which are worse than conifers, I think because they're generally deciduous and they suck a lot more water out in the summer and then don't do anything in the winter, whereas conifers are more even, sort of spread through because they're generally evergreen. And then they've also looked at which are the worst offenders, which trees suck the most moisture out of the ground. And the worst typical ones are oak, poplars, willows and eucalyptus. Eucalyptus, quite a new one, wasn't around a few years ago, but has been quite well planted over the last sort of 30 or 40 years or so. And what is supposed to happen, somebody designing a new foundation can simply look that up. You look up the distance that you are from the tree and the height of the tree. So here I've gone for a typical case of a 20 metre high oak at 20 metres distance. That's 20 there, 20 there. And that gives you a foundation depth required of 1.5 metres. So even those conservatories need a 1.5 metre deep foundation to cope with a tree 20 metres away. A 20 metre oak's a big oak, but it's not unusual. That's a pretty mature, full-size oak. And there's lots and lots of these about. And sadly, a lot of the companies, builders particularly, and even a lot of building inspectors just don't seem to be fully aware of this. Some of them are aware of it and think, oh, don't believe it, sort of thing. And then we get a dry summer and it all sort of comes home to roost. I had a quick look back at when these very dry summers occur, and I think they're a bit like buses. They do seem to come along in groups. The first one that I remember was 1976. That was when I just started my career. I was on my sandwich course. I used to go to university for 6 months and then go to work for 6 months with the same company every time. And I remember 76 was very hot, dry summer. Looking around the room, I think there's a few people who might also remember it, no offence. And you might remember Mr. Dennis Howells, I think his name was, who was Minister of Sport and was then appointed as Minister of Drought for the summer. And he was quite a personality. He was sort of, lampooned a lot on the television and stuff. And that's when these problems really first came to light. And prior to that, the building industry hadn't really worried about it. I think also the insurance industry hadn't necessarily covered subsidence in quite the same way. So it became quite an issue, and it was shortly after this that people like the Building Research Establishment went into doing a lot of research and measuring soil types and tree roots and so on, which then led to the NHBC guidance. And that came out, I think the first edition of that was in the late 70s and early 80s. So it really ought to be known about. It hasn't actually changed a great deal since. It's been sort of improved and added to, but the basic guidance is still pretty much the same. And looking back, we've had these dry years, 85, and then we had two together, 90 and 92, 95 and 96 again together, 2003, 6, and then 2018 was an odd one. That was very wet, if I remember, very early, and then dried out later on. That was a bit of an unusual one. And then last year was a typical hot, long, dry drought. And of course, it's not just domestic buildings that get affected. So I put an industrial one in here for a bit of a change. This was some industrial units. Again, not very old, 20, 30 years old. At the back of this was a cemetery with a line of trees and clay soil again. And this was a typical cracking inside of the blockwork. Not a huge amount of movement. I mean, what's that, 5, 6 mil maybe. It's not a lot, but it's enough to get people concerned. And the question is, what do you do about it? The floor slab had also dropped, and with an industrial building, it's tenanted, nobody wants to do much about it. Quite tricky to deal with, really, in that sort of situation, because nobody wants to vacate the building and relay all the floors. Not easy situations. I'll come on to some possible solutions shortly, but I was just going to move on to some other causes of subsidence. I've talked a lot about the clay and trees, and that's particularly, I suppose, over the last year. Most of the subsidence cases that I'm seeing are due to the clay and trees problem. There's been an awful lot of that, particularly in the south part of this area where we've got a lot of clay. But there are a lot of other causes of subsidence, and I suppose in typical order of the ones that I'm seeing, leaking drains is a major problem. Shallow foundations also, which is that subsidence? Well, there's a lot of argument, particularly with insurance companies, as to what constitutes subsidence and what constitutes settlement. And there is a definition that says that subsidence is the ground moving away under the building. So the ground shrinks and the building follows. That's subsidence. But settlement is the building squashing into the ground, the building crushing the soil. So the weight of the building making the soil compress. And that's technically settlement, sorry. And I believe the insurance industry, a lot of the insurance industry have adopted that. Although I have recently seen people sort of mixing up the two. So it's not hard and fast, but that's a commonly accepted definition, if you like, of the difference between the two, between what is subsidence and what is settlement. Shallow foundations really generally is more a settlement problem. And poor soil obviously tends to be a settlement issue rather than a subsidence issue. The poor soil simply won't support the weight of the building and everything compresses and the building drops. And I've stuck another one on the end there, which is sinkholes, which is not a common problem in numbers terms, but it occurs in certain areas. And I've got a bit more example on that, but particularly in chalk soils, the chalk can dissolve, called solution features or sinkholes, and simply create a hole, which can be quite small, quite local. It can affect just one corner of a building where we have an outcropping chalk soil. Particularly a problem north of Portsmouth, Waterloo, Ville, Horndean, Lovedean, that whole area between Portsmouth and Petersfield is particularly prone to it. Also around Reading and Caversham. Caversham, the name comes from caverns in the chalk. And those areas, anywhere where there's a chalk outcrop, that's a possibility. And it can be very localised. I mean, it can affect one corner of a building and nothing else. So a few examples of the other issues that I've seen causing subsidence. I say leaking drains. Leaking drains is a very common problem. If it's a clay soil and the drain's leaking over a long time, the ground softens and then the building sinks into it. Insurance companies normally treat this as escape of water, as a claim under escape of water rather than subsidence or settlement. And if you're dealing with one, it's better for the householder because the excess is much less on escape of water than it is on subsidence. This was an interesting little case. This was originally, you know, an external WC and a coal shed probably, and had been sort of upgraded with a modern roof. I think it's the original brickwork tidied up, some nice new French doors and stuff, and a gutter put in, which also served this little bit of neighbouring roof. Gutter ends there, and there's no downpipe. They couldn't be bothered putting a downpipe in. I suppose it's going to cost 50 quid or something. So all the water coming off this little roof, running down here, just pouring straight onto the ground at this corner, causing either softening of the clay, or if it's a gravelly, sandy soil, it washes the fine material away and simply causes it to compact, and the building moves under it. So for the sake of, you know, I reckon what, 50 or 100 quid, if they put a downpipe in, there's a gully there already collecting rainwater off the roof, so they could have just run it into that, but they didn't bother and ended up with a bit of subsidence. That's opened up around the damp course, and there was cracking inside and so on. Solution to that obviously was put a downpipe in, but if this didn't recover, once you put the downpipe in, you've got to wait for that. Really, normally the solution is to wait, having repaired the drainage, to see whether the ground does recover. Often it does, and then simply repair it. This was a sale and purchase situation, and they wanted to get on with it very quickly. So I suggested they could just take this wall from here to here, take that down, put a new foundation in, rebuild it, and put a downpipe into there. I guess that would cost, you know, up to £10,000 maybe, and is a solution because they were trying to sell the property. If they were staying there, they could have simply put a downpipe in, repaired it, monitored it, and job done really. Some other examples. This is a case really of shallow foundations, and I've put there, is it subsidence or settlement? Well, depends whether you're the insurance company or the householder. I think this was a 1930s house, no real external factors involved, on a sloping site, not hugely sloping, but sloping a bit. And I think the foundations at the back would be effectively deeper than the foundations at the front, because the foundations are probably put in level and the ground slopes. And I think it had been moving for many years. There were some huge cracks inside, and the dip across the inside of that porch, you can see on there, you know, it's about 1 inch or 2 running across just inside that porch. And they've probably been going on for years. And I think that's settlement of the foundations rather than subsidence, because I think it's simply a shallow foundation squashing into what is probably relatively soft soil at fairly shallow depth. This is just an interesting case of poor soil. This is a lovely old house, Victorian property. I think it was described as a Victorian villa. I don't know what the definition of that is. If there's any estate agents amongst us, perhaps we could, you know, perhaps somebody could enlighten me. But it was described as a Victorian villa, lovely old property. This is actually on an area called the Great Morass in Portsmouth, which I guess some people are probably aware of if you cover that area. The centre of Southsea, or a big chunk of the centre of Southsea, was built on an area that was originally a sort of peat bog, or like a salt marsh from the sea. And in Victorian times, they were a bit short of land, so they levelled this up. I think it was a bit of a dip, you know. They levelled it up, and then they thought, well, that's a nice bit of land, we'll build on that. So they built all these houses all over it with just normal Victorian foundations, you know, a couple of feet deep. And over the years, over the last, whatever that is, 150 years, most of these have now been pulled down and modern buildings put up with deep piled foundations. The peat is up to 25 metres deep in places, you know. But this was quite an unusual one, because this had been simply patched up over the years. It had just been repaired and repaired and repaired, and it had moved all over the place. And this was an example of looking at the levels on the floors. And I think every floor dipped quite massively, but in a different direction. It was like the sort of house that Jack built at the fun fair. You know, everything went all over the place. But it hadn't fallen down. Perhaps it should have done. It hadn't. And somebody bought it and was sort of renovating it to use as a buy-to-let. And that's an example of some of the cracking that was present where they'd stripped some of the plaster off to renovate, and there's these huge old cracks inside. Typical crack there out, so it's been rendered, I guess, at some point to try and cover up all the previous problems, and had cracked again. And I'm not sure, the photo's at a bit of an angle, but if you see the slope on that, that's not the photo. That's actually the slope on the thing. And if you look at that square there, the shelving was level, but the door head dips, what, 2 inches across that old doorway, that cupboard doorway, and it dipped about 5 or 6 inches across the length of the room. Quite amazing. I was quite amazed it was still standing up, and the walls were out of plumb, everything was going all over the place, but it hadn't fallen down, just been patched up and patched up and patched up, and I think it'll carry on. I mean, it's in the middle of the Great Morass, and this lady was buying it, going to do it all up and rent it out. So, having been through those, you know, what are the sort of solutions? Well, where we're dealing with subsidence or settlement, really, the best solution is to remove the cause. If we can get rid of the cause, then we've solved the problem. And for example, if it's a clay and trees problem, then cut the trees down. Environmentally, that's pretty awful. I mean, I'm a great tree lover, it's a bit of a hobby of mine, but if it's your house and you've got trees and it's cracking, you want to solve the problem, you're going to cut the trees down. Even if they've got TPOs on them, the TPOs can be overturned if they're causing damage to a building. So that's generally the easiest and the best solution. If it's a leaking drain, then we fix the drain. And as I say, in most cases, having fixed the drain, then the ground doesn't recover, but it will sort of stiffen up again. Once the source of the water's gone, if it's clay, it will stiffen up. If it's sand or gravel, it will stop compacting once the source of the water's taken away. So the usual thing is to then get rid of the problem, monitor the building, you know, has getting rid of it actually stopped the movement? 6 months or a year needed usually, and then provided there's no more movement, then repair all the cracks, straighten everything up. Underpinning these days is generally seen as a last resort. Bit of a shame for some of us. Back in the 80s and 90s, you know, insurance companies were happy to pay for underpinning. If a property had subsidence, they would just agree to underpin it. But it sort of occurred to them, I think, towards the end of the 90s, this was costing them an awful lot of money, and that technically underpinning is betterment. They don't have to pay for underpinning, so they decided they wouldn't. So come the beginning of the sort of 2000s, they stopped paying for underpinning and they fight tooth and nail to try and do everything else first. So their solution is always to remove the source of the problem, monitor it and repair it. They will agree to underpinning these days, but only if, having done those first few steps, if it doesn't stop moving. If they've cut the trees down and it keeps going, or they've repaired the drains and it keeps going, they will agree eventually to underpin it. But it takes a long time, a lot of effort. Bit of a shame, because some of us used to, you know, get a lot of work out of underpinning in the good old days. But there we go, that's life. So, as an example of the problems where, and I'm being a bit harsh here on insurance companies, and I was talking to somebody the other day and I did say, well, I see all these problems, but then they said to me, yeah, but surely you only see the problem cases. And I thought, well, that's true. People don't come to me when it's all gone smoothly and everything's wonderful and, you know, everybody's happy. So I get a bit of a jaundiced view, I suppose. I only get the cases where people are having a battle with their insurance company, or they've done something and it hasn't worked. So I'm probably a bit prejudiced there. But this is an example. This is a nice little 1970s house. And this is a view, that's the front of the house there, and these are some trees just across the other side here in different ownership. This was a hedge line, and there was a sort of field opposite containing a lot of trees. And the house had had some subsidence 6-7 years ago, and the insurance company had come along. They'd done investigations, they tested the soil, they'd found some tree roots, found some roots from an oak tree. These are all oaks. So they identified the biggest and the closest oak, and they cut that down and said, well, that must be the cause of the problem. They monitored it, and of course it didn't move again. So they spent an awful lot of money repairing the house. It had a lot of cracks, I believe. They replaced window frames, they squared up, took floors up, re-levelled the floors, redecorated the whole house, repaired all the brickwork, rebuilt the steps, the paths, spent an awful lot of money on the house, but didn't underpin it. And I think often they kind of get away with that because the following year, if it's not another dry summer, it wouldn't subside again anyway. What I think they'd missed here was that they still left all these other trees. I mean, I'm not suggesting they cut them all down because that's pretty awful, but they couldn't really get rid of the source of the problem. And the owner of the house was having real problems selling, kept putting it on the market, get an offer and agree it, and then the buyer would have to drop out because couldn't get a mortgage, because couldn't get insurance, because nobody like me was prepared to say that this couldn't happen again. And I did them a nice report and said, well, it hasn't got subsidence anymore. It had subsidence, I believe. There's no sign of subsidence now, but I don't think that was sufficient. The insurance companies were looking for somebody like me to say, this won't subside again, or, you know, the foundations comply with building regulations. Well, clearly they didn't. We had the details of the trial pits, and with these trees present, and given the NHBC guidance, etc., this doesn't comply. I don't know what the outcome was. I imagine they ended up having to sell it for cash at an auction or something because they simply couldn't get a mortgage, which is a real shame. I mean, I'm bashing the insurance companies here a bit. I don't know if there's any insurance company surveyors or representatives present. If so, I apologise, but you know, there we go. So the other thing I mentioned were sinkholes, and these, as I say, can be a particular problem in chalk soils. This was a case, an early case from my own career. This was when I was a young, so when I was a sandwich student, as we called me, and in those days I was a bit keener. This was a block of housing association flats, and the company that I was working for had designed the structure and the foundations for these flats, and they were virtually finished. You know, they were doing the sort of decorating and fitting out, and the contractors, one of their little dump trucks vanished down a hole on the site, and they got a crane in and pulled it out, and they thought it was an old well, and they got a chap to go down it, and it wasn't a well at all. It was a shaft in a chalk mine, and what they discovered was that under this building was an unknown, previously undiscovered chalk mine. And these are quite common in the Caversham area. This was in Caversham. And I was sort of younger, fitter, several stones younger in those days, and I could fit down one of these. I don't think I'd fit down there today. And I volunteered to be part of the team that went down, and we were down there for several weeks, and we did a land survey and sort of mapped the whole thing out. Interestingly, these are some of the adits of the old mine. This was a vertical shaft, and we think there must have been a bigger adit, an entranceway somewhere, which would have gone in more on a gentle gradient, because you wouldn't have got the chalk out bringing it up here. I mean, we had to go down on rope ladders, and eventually we got this sort of permanent ladder put in. These are sort of fairly small ones. The largest one was like the size of this barn. It was like sort of almost like the size of a cinema, absolutely enormous. And they went back to the sort of, I think we found carvings and initials, like sort of old graffiti in the walls. where people had carved their initials. And the earliest ones we found went back to something like 1770. And there were lots of local stories about prisoners being put down there, and they used it apparently for storage during the Second World War. They stored records and this sort of stuff, documents and stuff down there. It was dry. It was, there was no sign of any water anywhere. And the largest of these adits under the house, under the buildings here, the crest of the adit was only about 1 metre below the foundations of the house. So we discovered, having plotted it all out. And of course it hadn't been found during the site investigation. They'd simply missed it. I think it was just bad luck. Wherever they put the boreholes, they hadn't found these adits and things. So I believe that the Housing Association decided just to sort of live with it. If it's a smaller thing, you can grout it up. If it's a single sinkhole, just in a small area, you normally just grout it up with sort of liquid concrete. And you can fill these in, I believe, with foamed concrete. But this was enormous and was also of historical interest. So the local authority were keen to keep it, and I believe it's still there, although it's sealed up and it's only opened to historians and people with a reason. It's not open to the public because we never found the original adit, which would have gone in more at a sort of level. Presumably that had collapsed at some point. We don't know where, somewhere under the building or away from the buildings. So there was only these deep vertical shafts. The deepest one went down about 30 metres. So quite a sizable thing. And the Housing Association decided just to live with it. I think because it was a managed property, they decided simply to monitor it. Couldn't really do much else. I mean, the alternative was, to abandon it or rebuild it somewhere else. Not very practical. But because it's a managed property, I think they felt they could simply live with it, keep it monitored. And as far as I know, it's fine. I don't think it ever suffered from any problems. I think it's still there today. That's a fairly recent photograph. So as far as I know, it was all, tickety-boo. A few other examples. These are some more sinkholes. These are a bit extreme, these. I mean, I hope we don't find these every day. That one was in Hertfordshire. I think that was caused simply through a leaking water main. This is a small cul-de-sac of houses, and there was a leaking water main running through the site, which had been leaking for years. Nobody knew about it. And one day, what was a little pothole, somebody turned up to repair the pothole, started digging it out, and this appeared underneath. And that's purely continuous leaking water dissolving the chalk in a particularly weak spot. That was quite exciting at the time, and I believe that's been fixed now. Again, filled in with foamed concrete. The water main was relocated and fixed, and then the hole was filled in with foamed concrete. That was in the centre of Reading. That's just taken out of the news, a news item. And again, that was a leaking water main running down a road, causing solution of the chalk and a sinkhole. I don't believe anybody was injured in any of these, luckily. I think that was the nearest it got to. That car didn't come off too well, unfortunately. A couple more examples of other things. These are a couple of cases of examples of things that I find personally slightly difficult to deal with. This one's floor slab settlement, which happens often in bungalows. I think particularly because this type of construction was used a lot in bungalows. And a lot of bungalows were built in the 50s and 60s when the old traditional timber floors were not so popular and they were starting to use solid concrete floors. And what happens is that under the floor there's a build-up of material. They construct the foundations, build the walls up to ground level, then they infill between the walls and cast the concrete floor on the top. And if that material is not good, if it's got any deleterious material in it, particularly organic material, topsoil or any sort of rubbish in it, then it can simply compact due to as the material rots away or simply compresses. And sadly, builders, I'm maligning builders, I know, but builders will still not always do these things properly if they're allowed to. And just a little example there. A few years ago, we designed some housing association, again, properties with solid floor slabs. And we were charged with inspecting these, going along, checking what the builders were doing. And I went along as a young engineer and talking to this builder, and I said, right, so you're ready to put these floor slabs down soon? And he said, yeah, we've got all the foundations in, we've got the walls up, yeah, we're going to put the stuff in, we're going to bring the rubbish in, we'll put all the rubbish down, and then we'll cast the floor slab. But I said, what's rubbish? You can't use rubbish. And he said, no, sorry, I didn't mean rubbish, I meant selected rubbish. And I think, unfortunately, it does still happen, although more and more, I suppose, are using concrete beam and block, which are suspended floors where the joists are built into the walls, and that avoids the problem. The NHBC, again, have come up with guidance, and their rules say that if the depth of makeup underneath the floor is greater than 600 millimetres, then you shouldn't use this type of solid concrete floor. And the reason for that is that you simply can't compact the material beneath. I mean, it should be granular material. They usually use like crushed rock, sort of stuff you put under a road. And then you can compact that in layers. But often they don't, or they still put rubbish in there. And I have come across that quite recently on a very newly built house where we had a bit of a problem, drilled a hole through one of the walls, and there was a terrible smell coming out, and they'd simply used, domestic rubbish. They'd included builder's waste and all sorts of rubbish in the build-up material. And this is, pretty new building. So when I get called in to look at these, the issue is always, is it going to carry on? And I think very often I can tell that if it's, if you've got the old original thermoplastic or whatever they are, tiles, and I can see that they've been there since the beginning, that everything's old, and there's a lot of dirt around the gaps and so on, then the chances are that it probably just, the settlement happened shortly after it was built, and it's probably not going to happen again. Or most of it's occurred. If there is any further movement, it's going to be very small. What I'm looking for is, has that movement, does it look like that movement has carried on? So have the skirtings been, does it appear the skirtings have been taken off and put back again several times? Are there bits of filleted beading around the skirting? Can I see different layers of paint where the floor slab has moved and then the skirting's been painted, and it's moved again and the skirting's been painted again? Very often I'm happy to say that the floor has moved probably when the building was new in the first year or so, and it's probably not going to move again. And in which case, it's fairly simple to correct. You can put down one of these levelling screeds, which goes in as a liquid, you pour it in, and it sets hard, levels the floor up. But not always possible. If I can't say that, if I think it looks like it has carried on moving, and there may therefore be, ongoing compaction of the material underneath, can be very difficult to fix. Can be done by mini piling, that's very expensive, very disruptive. Not an easy one to deal with. The other ones I don't like are loft conversions where they've been done without building regulations. And I quite often get called or asked to look at these. Normally I try and avoid them, to be honest, because for several reasons. This is a slightly interesting photo. The photo's not quite as bad as it looks. It looks there as if the door won't close, doesn't it? But it does. I think it did close. It's just the angle of the photo. But this was had been done by an amateur. Somebody, a householder, had done this themselves, and they'd left this lovely strut in the middle of this room. Bit of a feature, I suppose. And this other room, I mean, you could barely stand up in there. You could only stand up along this little bit here. Everywhere there, you had to sort of bend over. But for me, the difficulty is that often somebody sees this, is aware that there isn't building regulations, hasn't been through building regulations. And I'm often asked, particularly by people who are selling the house, can you just come and have a quick look and tell me it's okay? Well, no. I mean, firstly, I can't just come and have a quick look. I never do that. And secondly, I'm probably going to tell you it's not okay. They're very difficult to deal with, I find, for several reasons. One, it's really difficult to get the information you need to assess this. I mean, in doing the design for a loft conversion, you're checking every piece of timber effectively. And even if there's a sort of access hole, you know, you can only see one little bit of the roof. You can't see everything. Owners don't want you ripping down ceilings, taking up floorboards. And without that information, it's almost impossible. Whilst you can say perhaps if it looks all right, or if it feels all right, and there's no sign of any real problems, then on occasion I can say, well, I'm not concerned about the structural safety. You know, it's been there for 20 years. There's no sign of excessive deflection or movement. It's all fairly rigid, but I still can't tell you that it complies with building regulations, which seems to be generally what people want to hear. In order to come to that, or in order to design a solution so that it would comply with building regulations, is a huge amount of work, and it's very difficult. It needs a lot of investigation. You've got to understand where every bit of timber's going, how the whole thing's held together, and then invariably it doesn't comply at the moment. If it had complied, you know, then they would have submitted it probably. And it's often not possible to get enough strengthening in there to make it comply. It can be really, really difficult to deal with. So personally, I don't like them, and I try and avoid them. And very often also I think that I'm not necessarily going to provide value for money to the client, because if a surveyor's gone along and said, well, I know this hasn't got building regs, it doesn't look very good to me, I'm just going to say the same thing. Unless I can go in there and strip it all out and do loads of calculations on it, and even if I do, I'm probably just going to tell you it doesn't comply with building regs. It's not very good. And I don't think that's really providing them with good service or good value for money, simply to repeat what they've already been told. So personally, I try and swerve those ones, or give them a bit of free advice and just say, you know, buy somewhere else. This is another example of ones that I often get asked to look at, where people have removed walls and put beams in. Very often, again, without building regulations. I find these a bit easier to deal with because you can see what's going on. Very often you can see if there's a beam there. Whilst you might not be able to see the beam itself, if it's encased in plasterboard, but you can see that there is a beam there. And provided there's no sign of major cracking or deflection or movement, then I'm usually happy to say I don't have any concerns for structural safety. I can't say it complies with building regulations, again, without stripping it all out and doing calculations. But most times people seem to be happy to accept the fact that I can say, look, there's no sign of excessive deflection, there's no sign of any sagging or movement, I'm not concerned about the safety. Basically, it's okay. This was perhaps a bit of an extreme example. This had received building regulations, but this was a slightly unusual one, where this was an old Victorian house with a rear wing, 2-storey, which was divided into, I think, 3 flats. And each flat owner effectively owned their flat, you know, on a 99-year or whatever lease. The chap who bought the ground floor flat had decided to extend the whole of his little ground floor bit right across the whole width and sort of fill this in to make one big wide extension. And I'll just flip to the next slide. That's the internal view. And he'd had these quite large beams put in, and he'd had a very thin lintel put in above there. So what had happened was that I think this had just been badly done in the building process. The design, on paper, it looked fine and it had building regulations approval. But I think whoever had done the building work, he hadn't done it himself, he'd had a builder in, but they simply hadn't propped it or pinned it, needled it, whatever, properly, and had, in doing the putting the beams in, the whole thing above had moved and had dropped onto the beams, and the beams had deflected, causing this sort of cracking in the brickwork. That's a view looking onto that side corner there. And there's what, 50 millimetres of movement there? And obviously the people who are living in this flat upstairs, you know, understandably weren't too happy about it. Quite a problem, this one, and I think really the only solution here was that all this brickwork needed to be taken down and rebuilt. Interesting, I suppose, that I think on paper it looked okay, and inside there it looks okay, but what's not being appreciated, there's a tiny little brick pier left there of the original brickwork, and apart from having all this load on it, it's very fragile. Must have been very fragile while the building work was being done. And this lovely new blockwork is simply butted up to it. You can't bond that into the brickwork. So it's just tied in with metal fixings, metal ties. And I don't think it's really sharing the load properly. So all the load's ending up coming down this little tiny bit of old brickwork, added to which I guess the temporary works probably wasn't very good. They probably took the acro props out too soon. So a bit of a mess, that one. Luckily, that's a bit of an extreme case. I don't see those very often at that degree. Normally, it's just something where somebody's not had building regs. As I say, I'm happy to say that it's, you know, structurally, I don't have any concerns for safety, but still can't say that it complies with building regs. So I don't know how we've gone for time. I think that's about all I've got to say. So thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. Yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you.